The second thing you need to be aware of is that Mickey and I are going to tag team this discussion. And while we're the guys on the stage talking about what you should know, what we need to know, you need to understand that the two guys on this stage are not perfect husbands. Now, I can assure you, you will have a hard time convincing our wives of that. But
I was just going to say, first service we had it easy because our wives wasn't here.
Yeah.
Now they're in here, so we're really going to have to be careful what we say.
I believe they would fight you tooth and nail, though, if you said they're not perfect, because they really believe that. The reason I say that is because this discussion needs grace, needs to be grace applied to it. And one of the things that my dad always said when he was talking to husbands and wives, he would say, I wish I could have the wives in to talk to them, let them leave, bring the husbands in, and talk to the husbands. And the reason for that is because what we'll say to the husbands is none of the wives' business. And what we'll say to the wives is none of the husbands' business in one way. And it's this way, in that so many people would say, okay, I'm willing to do what you tell me to do if he or she does what they're supposed to do. But the truth is that has no bearing on this discussion whatsoever. The fact of the matter is that this is a commandment from God. That God is commanding the husbands to do one thing. There's a lot of things, but we're just talking about one today. And He's commanding the wives to do one thing. He doesn't say, well, if they do it, then you can do it. If they don't worry about it. No, it's just straight, flat out, here's the commandment. Here's what's expected. Another thing that would be helpful to understand is that we're going to start with the guys. And guys, it's actually in your favor that we're doing this because of the fact that's the way it came to me as I was studying, preparing. This is kind of the way what the Lord gave it to me. So that's the first reason. But for me, I'm always the kind of guy that if you've got a line of people here and you've got to have that hard discussion with us, I want to be first. Let me get mine out of the way. You go ahead and tell me what I need to know, and I'll make adjustments as I need to, and then we'll move on. I can relax while the rest of them are getting theirs. And so we're going to deal with the guys first. We'll talk for 10 or 12 minutes, although if it's like the first service, we may go a little longer. And then we'll get to the ladies. Ladies, you just hang on. We're coming. We're coming. Promise you, we're coming. Throughout the course of our study this morning, while most of the stuff we're going to talk about is common sense, it's just pretty much common sense. It's God's commandments to us. We know when God commands something, it's always for our good. There also needs to be understood that included with this are going to be some pretty hard truths. There are going to be some things that come out of this that you kind of back up on, and maybe you buck up against a little bit. Please understand, this is part of the discussion. As I said, we're not perfect husbands, but we do have the benefit of a lot of education, benefit of marriages. Both of our marriages are pretty long. Mine's be 33 years in December. Mickey and Candace, Melinda and I have been married 33. Mickey and Candace have been married for 62, 63 years. 26 years. So I just had it backwards. I'm dyslexic. For 26 years. So we've got the benefit of lengthy marriages. There's some things we've encountered in our marriages that maybe you haven't. That's on the horizon for you. We've also had the benefit of having talked with countless couples throughout our ministries. And I can assure you, we've covered pretty much all the topics in that need to be covered. Very rarely does someone come in and say, I'm going to tell you something you've never heard before, and it actually be true. It has happened, but it's pretty rare. So we have the benefit of that information to share with you. And while we're not perfect, while we don't have the ability to say we do all of these exactly the way they're supposed to be done, we do have information that we think will greatly benefit you in your marriage. And so what we're asking, pay attention, absorb the information, don't be offended by it if something strikes you wrong. Just say, hey, that's what God says. I'm just gonna take it for what it is, and I'm going to improve my marriage. If we go into this with the concept, you know what, today is a day that I'm going to improve my marriage, I'm going to start that process today, then we'll come out of this service a whole lot better off. okay? So whether you're husband and wife, or you're a potential husband and wife someday, or you talk with people who are, which I believe that's going to include all of us, then you have an opportunity to be impacted and affected in a very positive way through this study today, okay? So pay attention.
So we are going to start with the responsibility of the husband. And let me just also say the reason we're going to do that also is that's how God dealt with it. We're going to see in Ephesians 5 that he dealt with the husband first. And I really do believe that if the husband does his responsibility well, it makes it very easy for the wife to do her responsibility well. And then you could say vice versa. If he doesn't, it makes it very difficult for the wife. So I think so much is on the husband in his role in the home. So we're just going to walk through this. Responsibility of husband, number one, is to say, I love you. All right? And we're going to look at some passages from Ephesians 5. Let me read first Ephesians 5:33. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So we are, as men, husbands, we are to say to our wives that we love them, and we are to mean it. This verse is really a command to us, for us as husbands, to love our wives. Now, someone might say, well, I just don't feel like I love her anymore. Or, well, you just don't know how she treats me. If you knew how she treated me, you wouldn't think that I have to love her. Well, it's interesting. That's really not the issue. The issue is God says we're to love our wives as Christ loved the church. Now, think about that for a second. How did the church love Christ? We didn't. The church didn't love Christ. The world didn't love Christ. The world crucified Christ. But yet he loved the world and he loved the church. He set the model of what it means to love somebody, not just because they love you, but to love them and care for them, because that is your role. As a husband, we are called to love our wives. Even if we don't feel like it, we're called to do that. And we are to show affection to our wives. Our wives need affection. I just got done. Let's say I did a wedding in September. I did another wedding in October, and I'm getting ready to marry Sam and Reagan in December. So I've done premarital counsel of all three couples. And one of the things I'll say to the guys is, guys, you have got to show your wife affection. And, you know, I'm not a real affectionate person. I'm not. Candace can tell you. But I know how important it is for a wife to be shown affection. Because when she's shown affection, that is from her husband. That is communicating, saying, I love you and I care for you. Guys, even if we don't naturally feel like it, we got to learn how to show our wives affection. And one of the ways we do it is by simply saying, I love you.
Well, one of the big reasons for that, I think it's important to understand, guys, is that one of the reasons you tell your wife you love her is because it builds security into the relationship. Did you know one of the greatest needs of women is security? They may not understand it, may not know it, may not believe it. But the truth of the matter is, science proves it out. Women need security. And as we begin the process of telling them we love them, we're building security in the relationship. So what does that look like? Well, letter A, your next fill-in on your study guide, says that we do it and say it and mean it to the extent that we say it often. That's kind of redundant on the title, things to say often to your spouse, but here it is. This is one of those things that we are to say often to our spouse. It may seem a bit awkward for you at first, particularly if you didn't grow up in a home where this was said. It may be something that is hard to get out of your mouth, and yet it is so necessary. For me, it was difficulty. I mentioned the first week of our study and when I was introducing the topic that our family, we didn't say that a lot growing up. For whatever reason, there were some reasons behind it. We didn't say it a lot growing up. And so when I got into a relationship, it was hard for me to say those words. Now, once our daughter came along, it was much easier. Why? Because I'd already conquered that awkwardness. I'd already conquered that awkwardness to where now it's just simply something that I say. Now, while it's important to say it often, I believe it's very important because it establishes security in the relationship. Our wives need to hear that. It's more important that we show it. Letter B says that we say I love you and mean it to the extent that we say it with our actions. We say it with our actions. Words are big, but I can say something to my wife and then not back it up with my actions to the extent that eventually she's going to stop believing me. Eventually she's going to get to the point where it's just words. It's just talk. It's just noise. It means nothing. But if my actions speak louder than my words, if I reveal my heart, my love for her through my actions, then all of a sudden she begins to believe what I say. She has reason to believe. Now, early on in marriage, they may be naive just to believe it anyway, but eventually they're going to get to the point to where they're going to see some proof of it. So how do we show this proof? There are 3 ways listed, I believe, for you to fill in. Number 1, under letter B, is that we say it through personal sacrifice. Say it through personal sacrifice. You want to take this or you want me to?
We can just kind of take it together, I guess. Well, let me read the passage that we see this clearly illustrated. Again, from Ephesians 5, verse 25. Husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So we see here that Christ is the example, that we are to love our wives as Christ loved the church. True love is sacrificial. Christ is the perfect example. Many times, issues occur in marriages because of selfishness. Selfishness is one of the biggest reasons that marriages fail and marriages have so many issues because people are selfish. And a lot of times, and I'm going to say this, most of the times it's the husband. The husband is selfish. He's focused on his own needs, his own things, and not on the wife, and so that causes a lot of issues. Husband is supposed to create the environment and the climate of love in the home. Now, the wife contributes to that too, no doubt. But it's the husband's responsibility to do that. Now, let's remember this. Paul is writing this letter to the church in Ephesus, and he is writing it at a time the culture was not very friendly towards women. Matter of fact, women were considered almost like possessions and property, that they had no rights, okay? So just imagine that. A culture where women are looked at second class, to say the least, citizens. Almost like slaves is the way many men treated their wives. And so Paul is writing this to say, if you're a believer in Christ, you've got to totally change. If you're a follower of Christ and you have a wife, that in Christ, husbands, you are called to exchange this selfish, self-gratifying love for a humble, self-sacrificing love. Now, that is radical. That had to be radical to the first century believers to hear, I've got to sacrifice for her. I've got to care more for her than I care for myself, because that wasn't the culture. That's not what the culture taught. But that is what God was calling the husbands to do, to love their wives in such a way that they sacrifice for her like Christ did for the church.
I think when you talk about that sacrifice, you look then as how Christ sacrificed. How did he sacrifice? It was a physical sacrifice. I mean, it was a bodily sacrifice. He took upon the abuse that belonged to us. It should have been ours as sinful people. He took it on himself. He sacrificed physically for us. And we are to do the same thing. We are to be willing to lay down our lives to protect our wives if that's what's called for. But I think that even before that, even if that never happens, we ought to be willing to do other things that show sacrifice. For example, we come home from a hard day of work. It's been a tiring day, and we walk in and we see that the garbage can is full. Now, I don't know if your wife's like mine. That does something to my wife. It sets her off when that garbage can gets full. I don't know why. I like it being full. It's pretty, but she doesn't see it that way. And did you know that after a long time in our marriage, I found out that I could actually take the garbage out without being asked? I didn't have to be asked. She didn't get mad. She didn't. She really didn't. She was okay with me going in and taking that full garbage out to the garbage can. She didn't care at all. Did you know that there's something about when I want to come in and sit down on the couch and she knows I'm tired, and yet I do something like that, and it speaks volumes to her. It's telling her all along, it's building that security because I'm saying, you know what, I really do love you. I really do care what bothers you. I really care about what troubles you. I'm going to take care of it. Another example would be coming in, and I don't have this issue anymore because our daughter's much older than this, but you come in and you've had a bad day and you just want to sit on the couch and turn the TV on, and yet you see that your wife's also had a bad day. That instead of plopping down on the couch, you say, honey, listen, you go sit down. Let me take the kids outside. We'll go play for a while. You just get a moment to yourself. And maybe if you can afford it, you say, we're just going to go pick up, we're going to go get in the car, we're going to go pick up dinner. Don't worry about that. We'll go get it. We'll bring it back and we'll eat that way. Just enjoy some time. What am I telling her? I want to be on that couch. I'm pretty tired, but you know what? You mean so much to me. I love you so much that I'm going to do this for you. What a big deal. Number two, you got something?
Well, I was just going to say, husbands, we need to show our wives that they're valuable. We need to value our wives. And you do that by more than just your words, by your actions also. I read this, and I just thought about it, about the guy that went to the store, and he picked up a card and took it to the register, and the clerk says it's $5.50. And he says, $5.50, and he just walks out and leaves the card. And the clerk grabs the card, and he takes it back to the card section, and he's getting ready to put it in, and the card says, to my wife, because you mean so much to me. And, I thought about that, we can say a lot of things, but our actions really prove if we value our wives. And God has called us to value our wives.
That's really good. Number two under letter B is we say I love you, we mean it, and we show that by caring for them, we have to put the welfare of our wives ahead of our jobs, ahead of our hobbies, ahead of our friends, ahead of our family. And listen to this one. This is going to surprise you. We're supposed to put the welfare of our wives ahead of our children. Now, this is going to be a shock. I'm talking about in a relationship that your wife has to know that she's more important than your children. That's hard. Talking about hard truths, it's hard because we love our kids. We want to sacrifice for them. And we get really close to our kids. We're out in the ball field, or we're in the house on the floor playing or wrestling or whatever we do with our kids. It's hard then to make that disconnect to say, you know what, you're important to me, but I want you to know your mom's more important to me. You talk to her badly, you might as well be talking to me like that. I'm not putting up with it. And so we take a stand, and we let them know their value. What are we doing? We're increasing the security. We're growing the security. I really am important. He really does care.
We see 1 Timothy 5:8 says this, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So we are called to provide for our wives and for our household. That is our responsibility as husbands. And it's very important. I was thinking about this also. Caring, I think, is one of the greatest ways we communicate that we care about our wives is just by spending time with them. Spending just being focused on them and being able to talk and just spend time with them. I was talking to a student a few years back, and a lot of times you can learn some valuable things by just talking to students because they say things that are simple, but they make so much sense. I was talking to this young man. He was in middle school, and he was talking to me about his two grandpas. And he said, it's kind of weird because he said, I got one grandpa, and he said, every time I see him, the first thing he says is, I love you. And he said, and I always tell him I love you, but he said, it's weird because I don't know if he really loves me or not. He said, because he never really wants to be with me. He never wants to spend any time with me. I always feel like I'm kind of an inconvenience when I'm with him. But he said, I've got another grandpa that I don't know if I've ever heard him say those words, I love you. But he said, man, he always wants to be with me. He goes to everything that I do. If I do something at school, he's there. If I'm playing ball, he's there. Everywhere I go, he's always calling me to see if I want to go somewhere with him. And he said, when I'm with him, I just know I'm loved. And I started thinking about that. You know, we can say a lot of things, but our time will show really what we value. And husbands, we have to value our wives by spending time with them. And not spending time while the ball game's going on. I'm bad about doing that. Or like, what did you say? Hang on, after this play, you know. But valuing them so we're really listening to them. And we share openly with them. They share openly with us. And that's the way I think just an incredible bond is built between couples.
I think that you have to find out what's important to your wife, and then you go with that. You implement it. Now, I can tell you one of the most horrible, the most despicable, the most tragic torments that the world has ever unleashed upon mankind are the Hallmark Christmas movies. And yet, for some reason, our wives love those things. You know, how bad would it be for me to, and here I am setting myself up, how bad would it be for me to go in and say, you know what, that's important to you. Let's watch one. I don't mean watch them all day. Maybe you can, but maybe in between Die Hard and one of the Bourne movies, you squeeze in a Hallmark Christmas movie or something. And you just show, you know, what's important to you is important to me as well. Little things matter. Number three.
Yeah, number three, another way is we say it by pointing them to Christ. Husbands, we have the responsibility spiritually for our wives and our children. Our wives do not have a spiritual responsibility for our husband. Husbands have a spiritual responsibility for everybody in the household. That is what God has called us to do. And that is a huge responsibility. You know, I just think about that, and immediately I think about my failures in that, as far as leading my wife and my children and pointing them to Christ. That is what God has called us to do. And if we really love our wives, we're going to do that. And if we really love our kids, we're going to do that with them too, to point them to Jesus Christ.
Absolutely. So guys, here it is. We've got a responsibility, and that is to say I love you through our words, through our actions. So then now it's time we make a commitment. God, I'm weak in this area, I'm stronger in this part of it, but weak in this, or I'm weak in all that, or I'm strong in all that, whatever. Regardless, God, I want you to grow me, make me better, strengthen my marriage by allowing me to follow your instructions here today. Number two, wives, it's your time now. I know you've been anxiously anticipating this part. Here we come. Number two, responsibility of the wife is to say, I respect you. I respect you. The verse is the same, Ephesians 5:33. The first part, nevertheless, let each one of you, in particular, so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. This part is going to be hard for some, because I can imagine that some of you sitting there thinking, he's never earned my respect. How am I going to say that? He's never earned my respect. After the first service, Mickey and I were talking a little bit about this and maybe expanding upon this thought just a little bit, and I think it's a good thing to do. For someone to say, my husband has not earned my respect, there is nothing about my husband that I respect, how do you say still, I respect you? Or should you? Should you? Truth of the matter is that this is a commandment from God. God doesn't put conditions on it. God doesn't say, if he's earned your respect, you show him respect. He just simply says, let the wife see that she respects her husband. So then where do we draw the line here? You know, I think that there are times when separation is necessary. The one particular thought that comes to my mind is abuse. There's abuse in the home, then I think you have I think you have not only the permission but the responsibility from God to separate from that situation, to protect yourself and your children. I think that's a responsibility God gives you. You're caring for your own. I think, though, that even in that situation, it doesn't change the responsibility to show respect. Doesn't change that responsibility. You're not respecting what the individual does necessarily or what they don't do, but you're respecting the position that God has given them. Because I trust God, because I love God, because He's given me a commandment, even though I don't really want to do this, I'm going to follow the plan of God, and I'm going to show respect to my husband. Okay? Now, you need to understand something, that even as security is one of those basic needs of a female, respect is one of the basic needs of a male. We need that. We may never tell you that. Probably you'll never hear that come from our mouths other than right here on this stage. But we need it. We need the respect of our wives. There's something about it. There may be a few of you guys you're just so secure you don't need it. Yeah, God bless you. The rest of us, we're in the boat that we really need our wives to respect us. And so how do we go about that? What's the process of accomplishing that? Because you can say it, but this, just like the matter of I love you, it needs more than that. Really needs for there to be an action that follows it, that proves that this is real. It's not just a form of manipulation. This is a real deal for me. I really do. Because God's commanded it, I'm going to respect you just the way God intends. So how do we go about that? 3 ways you see listed on your sheet. Letter A is by following His leadership. By following His leadership. You say, God never intended me to follow His leadership. Actually, He did. Let me read a couple of verses to you. Colossians 3:18 says, wives, submit yourself to your husbands as to the Lord, as is fitting in the Lord, he said. Ephesians 5:22 through 24, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, His body, and is Himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. I'm going to throw out now some more hard truths to you. It seems like you're getting more hard truths than the guys did. I think us just getting to the point of communicating is hard enough, so we went a little more gentle on them. I think you're tough enough to handle it, ladies, and so I'm going to throw this out for your consideration. You need to understand something about your marriage. You are not intended to be your husband's mother. You are not intended to be your husband's boss. You are not intended to be a hindrance to your husband. But God has placed you in the family to be a helper. God expects you to be a helper to your wife, or to your husband, rather. God expects you to help him. You say, but Tom, you don't understand something. My husband will never step up and be the man to take the responsibility to do the things that need to be done. Then maybe you need to stop enabling him to do that. Maybe it is the fact that you've just let him get away with that, and therefore you just step into the role naturally. Maybe you want that role. But regardless, God says that you are to show respect, and one of the ways you do that is by following His leadership, the God-ordained leadership. Maybe what you need to do, and I'm not talking now about educating your children, about instructing them in the way of God. That's your responsibility as well as His. But in some things that don't have such a serious impact, you just in essence say to yourself, you know what? You're going to step up and be the man in this, or it's not going to get done. I'm not doing it. I've enabled you too long. And I don't mean in a critical way. I don't mean in a condemning way you've approached that. But you just simply let it be known, you know what, this is your responsibility. I'm going to be hands off. But the good news is, ladies, that you can help your husbands through this process. Melinda helped me. I can remember one thing. I'm not going to tell you what it was because you'll think it sounds silly. But she expected me to do this. In fact, one year she came in and she said, I've done this every year. I'm not doing it again. It's your turn. I didn't know how. I honestly did not know how. It literally put me near a panic to think about doing that because I didn't know how to do it. But she was kind enough to walk me through the process, to help me, just to gently help me step by step know what I needed to do. It's a pretty amazing thing. After that, I loved it. I mean, I did it all the time. She was a helper in the situation. She helped me accomplish something that I needed to accomplish. And the only reason I wasn't doing it was because I just didn't know how to do it. Didn't know how. You can be the helper. You can stop enabling and start assisting and help him become the person that God wants him to be, the person you want him to be. Now here again, we're talking about this area of grace. We need grace. It's not going to happen overnight, most likely. Maybe you're just going to be incredibly blessed. You leave here, your husband's a new person. Maybe. For the rest of us, we've got a process that we walk through to become better. It's this growth process, this maturing process that God allows us to develop little by little. And through that process, we watch our marriage get stronger and stronger, because what you're doing in this is you're saying, you know what, I respect you enough to know that you can do this, and I'm just going to back off and let you. Number A, letter B. You also do this by recognizing his efforts. By recognizing his efforts. 1 Thessalonians 5:18, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. You want to know what the will of God is for your life? Part of it is to be thankful, to be grateful. A little bit of appreciation goes a long way. You'd be surprised what it does for me when my wife says, hey, thank you for doing that. In me, subconsciously maybe, it shows me a little bit of respect. It shows that she appreciates what I'm doing. And it causes me to say, you know what, I want to feel that again. So what happens? I start doing more stuff without being asked. And eventually I get to the place where I am, nowhere near perfect, but a lot further ahead than I was 33 years ago. God begins to move me forward. You can help that simply by showing appreciation. You can help that. You can encourage that. You can promote that. You can be the facilitator simply by showing appreciation. Now, we'll talk about one more thing. Go ahead, Nadia.
I was just going to say, I don't think we can overstate the power of encouragement and affirmation. I think that's with all of our relationships that we need to be encouragers, but especially in a marriage relationship.
Let me throw this. Number 3 is by encouraging his life. By encouraging us. Go ahead and write down number 3 under letter B, or letter C. There is no letter B. That needs 3 points under it. So just letter C. Forget everything I said up until now. Letter C is where you're writing. You show that you respect him by encouraging his life.
Well, and I was just going to say, when a wife encourages her husband, that has great power. And I think it's somewhat because, and this is not every guy's not exactly the same, but many men are communicated love through words of affirmation. That's how they hear love. And it could be because their mom would say sweet things to them growing up, and they just learned, hey, that's how I get love, is when people say kind things to me. And many men are like that. And just words of affirmation just is almost like, I don't know, it's like puts gas in the tank. It just wants to help you to do more positive things. And when wives can do that for their husbands, it's so valuable. Yeah. And it helps, it just helps the relationship. And husbands should affirm their wives too. I'm not saying it's just a one-way street, but I'm saying that is so important when a wife's do that for a husband.
And how does that look? I think one of the ways you can see this out and see how it's supposed to look is when everybody else is telling your husband you can't or you'll never amount to anything, you be the one in the background that's cheering him on. You being the one in the background that's pushing him to bigger and better things. And you say, well, what if nothing ever changes? Okay, what if nothing ever changes? What have you lost? A little bit of pride, maybe? Maybe a little bit of time because you've invested in words and actions. You've tried to encourage and he's not responded to it. But actually, regardless if he responds or not, you're still the winner. Why? Because you've been obedient to God. You've done what God told you to do. God said, let the wife see that she respects her husband. So regardless whether he responds or not, there's no promises attached to this. God doesn't say, and if you do this, this is going to happen. No, it's just a simple statement. It's a simple command. This is what you're supposed to do. And so if he doesn't respond, nothing changes. The responsibility is the same. But what if he does? What if that little bit of encouragement is the very thing he needed? What if he's never had anybody encourage him before? You know, I would venture to say that in an auditorium, this many people in it, there's some guys in here, they've not had that support. They didn't have parents at home that were encouraging them, telling them they could do anything. They might have had the opposite. What a blessing it would be if you as a wife came along and said, you know what, you can do that. You can do that. I got confidence in you. What a show of respect. You're feeding and growing that which he desperately needs, and that is to know that he's respected.
The last thing I would say, and I would say this for both the husbands and the wives, is that we have to be intentional about doing what God says. I think naturally we're not going to do it just naturally what God's called us to do. Men are not going to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Women are not going to respect their husbands just naturally. We have to be intentional about doing that. It takes work. It takes time a lot of times to just learn to do that. But that is, to be intentional is how you really make a difference in your marriage.
And I think God tells us that. I think he tells us in that he commands husbands to love their wives. If it was a natural thing, if it's just going to happen, there'd be no need to give a command for it. But it's something that we have to be intentional. You're right. It takes effort. It takes discipline. For me to sit down and say, you know what? I'm not good at this. I'm going to work on it. I'm going to work on it. Ladies, for you to say, you know what? Some of that kind of offended me, but he's right. I'm not good at that. I'm going to work on it. And so we begin the process. And what I believe is, even though there's no promises attached to this, I believe very much that when we start doing these things, we're going to see a response. When the other understands that this really is real, it's not just a form of manipulation, we're going to see a response, and we're going to see an improvement in marriage like we've hoped would come, but just didn't know how to get it otherwise. So there it is. Guys, love your wives. Wives, respect your husbands. Will you do it? Will you work to make your marriage better?